Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Avorion episode 38. I'm Enigmius, and today we're continuing with the Serpovectem build. This time doing something a little bit different. We're focusing on sort of the wings that extend out from the sides of the ship. Obviously we're in space, we don't need wings, we don't need to generate lift in the traditional sense that wings would be applied, but they're kind of what I felt would be an interesting way to add a little bit of bulk to the ship, give it a little bit more of an aggressive sort of profile overall by having things spread out a little bit. Not necessarily necessary, but creative license being what it is and all, I decided that I would just go for it. When I first put the profiles in place, I didn't really say a whole lot about what I had intended for those parts of the ship in terms of the functionality, because I hadn't really thought of it. It was purely a cosmetic decision at the time. Now it seems like that could end up being a pretty reasonable platform for turrets, and having a place where we could put a lot of turrets and in a variety of different positions. If you have point defense turrets or things of that nature, you can have some pretty broad coverage, just because the wings are kind of large and they're spread out and they're mostly going to be flat. So that's one of the benefits of having them on the ship. After the fact, of course, is discovering that'll probably be a pretty reasonable place to put the turrets. Before we get that far, however, we have to resolve this issue of the transition from the main central hull section, sort of that long snake-like tube that is holding everything else together, to this sort of perpendicular wing kind of thing that's sticking out of either side. I roughed in the cutout, I guess you could say, for the part of the wing that will meet up with the rest of the hull. And now it's just a matter of doing all of that transition work, making everything come together in a way that makes sense. And it's kind of a really bizarre series of profiles that we're working with, because when I put that elliptical profile that you can sort of see now, that's marking where the wings will attach to the hull, when I put that in place, I was thinking in terms of the wings position on the hull, thinking in terms of how high up on the hull, how far back, how far forward, things like that. I wasn't really thinking in terms of how all of the different profiles would come together in the location that I chose. So as a result, what I ended up with is this kind of slanted section that we have to attach the wings to, that is also receiving a curve from the underside and a curve from the top side of the ship coming around and coming together with that. And then it's got that almost elliptical sort of profile when you're looking at it from the side. It's adding to that challenge factor and trying to make everything fit together in a way that I can live with. As I've been talking about basically throughout this entire build, and the criteria for determining whether or not a design for a particular hull element is something that I can keep or something that I'm going to have to ditch and redo. And in this case, it's the nice thing about it, and the key thing about it that made it quite a bit more approachable than it could have been, is that it's not really very large, this area that we're working in. So we can try a lot of different things fairly quickly, see what they look like. If they're not in line with what we had in mind, or if they're not producing the geometry that we need to make everything come together, we can remove it fairly quickly and try something else. And that was sort of the saving grace for what could have otherwise been quite an undertaking to try and make all of this come together. It's just one of those weird shapes. And as I was sort of roughing it in and getting everything in place, it was part of that whole process where I realized that this is just so many bizarre curves on this ship in all kinds of different places. But one of the things that I learned from this process, specifically in managing all of these transitions, and you can see we're pretty close to being done, but now we've got the final little crease where everything comes together, the side of the hull and the underside of the wing. We just have to resolve this last little section in order to be able to move on to other things. But when I was looking at it originally, after I finally got to this point where it was filled in, even though I wasn't necessarily convinced that it was going to be the final form that it would have when we were all said and done. But we got something in place, and I looked at it and I thought, man, that is just nasty. Like, it's lumpy. That's a word, I think, that's going to apply to so many other different places on this ship. It's already applied to so many different places as lumpy. But that was sort of my take on it when I first looked at it. And then when I signed back into the game to continue working on it, and I looked at what I had basically come up with, and it actually worked. I actually had a better impression of it when I came back to it a day later than I did the previous day when I finished working on it, which is not necessarily a common sort of thing. I mean, I've talked about this enough. There are times when I deliberately leave things sit for a day or two just to see how my impression of them changes. It's not too often it goes from a negative impression to a positive impression. What will quite often happen is I'll look at a design that I've come up with and I'll be kind of, ambivalent about it. It's not fantastic, but it's not too bad. And I leave it for a day or two, and what will happen is my impression of it will sort of decay over that time. It's that initial feeling of being glad to be done a particular part of the ship has faded, and now I'm looking at it a little bit more objectively and making the decision that, you know what, I'm really just not happy with it and I'm going to make some changes. That's more often the case. The other outcome as well is not necessarily thrilled about it, kind of ambivalent about it, but not necessarily negative about it. And after a day or two, I still feel the same way. And that's quite often how a lot of elements end up becoming a part of a build, is just because I wasn't unhappy with it and I didn't necessarily come up with any ideas to make it any better. And after a couple of days, I decided I could live with it, so I just moved on. Outside of that sort of window, that certain period of time after I finish it until I make the decision to keep it or not, I usually don't really give a lot of thought to things. I try not to second guess my designs too much, especially as time goes on, because if you've been following the builds that I've done in this game and previous series for other games, I can do some pretty long builds. And if I were in the habit of looking at things and just deciding on an ongoing basis to change them on a whim, I would never finish anything. And if you can imagine how long those series would be, it would be kind of rough. And I would imagine that it wouldn't take long before it sort of eroded the enjoyment that I got out of it. Just because you sometimes you just have to let it be. You got to move on. You got to let it be what it's going to be and carry on, and, onwards and upwards, I guess, would be probably a good way of describing it. But in this case, it was one of those rare situations where I wasn't feeling all that great about it, but I was kind of like, we'll let it sit. And then the next day I was like, you know what? I actually quite like that. It works. I'm happy with it. So that's how we ended up with this profile under the ship that we're looking at here. Specifically, what we're looking at here was, I got to the point where I was sort of done with it. The transition was in place. And then I came back to it and I looked at it and I said, the way everything is coming together is actually better than I thought. It's following some profiles better than I originally thought, because I was looking at it from a certain angle, and that was the word that came to mind, was just lumpy. And it wasn't necessarily the most positive feeling in the world. So I was glad. I was very glad. On a ship of this nature, where everything is a curve, devouring a curve, kind of nibbling on an angle, it's nice to look at something the day later and say, actually, that's a lot better than I sort of expected it would be when I was looking at it today. So we've got a lot of wee little pieces on this ship that were part of the layout, doing all of those profiles with the cubes, the little wee tiny cubes, basically the smallest cube that we could do. I've kind of resigned myself to the fact that there's probably going to be a certain amount of cleanup, especially on the interior of the main hull section, to gather up as many of these little cubes as possible and just get them out of the way. If they're not necessary for holding things together, if they're not providing some sort of meaningful defensive aspect, then we could probably get rid of them and use that extra space to put more useful components in. But we'll see how it goes. The one thing that I've kind of I wish was a little bit different, as you can see here, I sort of jumped ahead. We did that little transition on the underside, and now we're going to do this outer edge of the wing. And we'll just kind of get that started, headed in the direction that we want it to go. But you can see here I'm taking and highlighting all of these little individual cubes, and then I'm grouping them together because it makes it easier to do the placement of the angle blocks, the slope blocks that I want to use to refine this edge. So it's one thing that I noticed a while back when I started doing this is that the joining that we do here, even though we've got the mirror mode turned on, it's only on it still only applies to this part of the ship. It doesn't mirror to the other side of the ship. So we have blocks that used to be cubes that are now rectangles that we've joined together to make building a little bit easier at this stage of the process. But on the other side of the ship, they're all still cubes. And that's kind of one of those things that it gets a little bit wonky later on, because you don't want to go through those cubes on the underside individually and try and make sure that they all merge together in the same fashion that you've got on the original side where you merge them. But if you just sort of highlight them all and use the merge button, you generally get different geometry in terms of how many rectangles and the dimensions of those rectangles and where they're intersecting and doing all of these different things. So it's kind of less than ideal, but there's also not a whole hell of a lot that I can do about it. It would be a pretty large undertaking to take something even this size, which is really not all that big, and go around and try and manage each of these things so that it comes out in a uniform sort of way. I just can't see myself being that motivated for that long. It'll be one of those things where I'm pretty confident we'll have enough room in the ship to put the essential components that we need without feeling like we have to scrounge for each and every little cube possible. But it'll be a balancing act, figuring out where we can remove them to make space that would be useful and where we can just leave them because they're just too much of a pain in the ass and we wouldn't be getting enough out of them. And see, this is actually going together fairly quickly because it's a very, very simple process of just following the curves, using, first of all, the four-sided pyramid blocks, the more common blocks that I would use for the pyramid sort of shape, along with the interior corner, the inside corner blocks, matching them together and basically going around this curve between the two of them and filling it out so that we've got basically a 45-degree slope following up from the profile that we made and also down. I've got, for the first time ever, a displaced y-axis mirror plane, and by that I mean you have the option to change the location of the mirror plane so that it lines up with the part of the ship that makes sense to have the mirror plane there, as opposed to just taking it wherever it places it. So that's what I did in this case, because this was one of those rare situations where it did make sense to move the plane and actually use it, as opposed to just not using the mirror section for that particular axis. The end result is that this came together quite a bit faster than it would have, obviously, if we didn't have the mirror plane. But also, it's a little bit, I won't say off-putting, it's a little bit kind of confusing for the first little while, because you end up with the area that you're working on, and then just a little short distance away is the mirror plane doing what the mirror plane does. And it's just, there's stuff going on the screen and you see it, and in the back of your mind you know exactly what it is, but your first thought is to say, what the hell did that just do? It takes a little while. It takes a little while to get used to it. We're getting used to it. We're making good progress. We're getting this thing. You can see I decided to pause here in the middle of all of this building up and building out and doing all these things to rework this specific section of the profile where it wasn't working. It was a little bit off. And it was bugging me, because if you were to look at the line that was created by this curved outer wing section, it had a little step in it. Instead of following a nice smooth curve, it just had this little step where it started going in a little bit more aggressively than it was, and then it steps out, and then it goes back to the regular curve, and it just wasn't working for me. So it took maybe a minute of real time to kind of goof around with it and figure out what a better solution would be. And then we continue on and we start filling in all of these little details. So this part here specifically that we're working on is going to be sort of like a ridge around this outer sort of curve of the wing. It's not going to be necessarily all that big, but it is going to be a little bit thicker than the rest of the wing. So it's just a cosmetic detail. It's not, I don't expect to be all that functional in terms of its defensive capabilities, but it is something that will add, again, a little bit of extra mass, visible mass to the ship, so that it gives a slightly more robust sense than just having this as sort of a flat wing section that obviously serves no purpose in space. So we're making good progress. I'm going to continue working on the main hull, working our way through that. We're also going to be working a little bit on the wings here and there, just trying to mix things up a little bit, add a little bit of diversity so that we don't get stuck doing one thing for too long. The next episode, I suspect, will involve doing the top side of the profile for the wings, where they come up with the main hull. We'll do a little bit of that. We'll do a little bit more work on the wings themselves, and then we'll go from there. So if you want to be notified about the next and future episodes in this and other series, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.